Doctrine and Covenants 107 was one of the most significant sections of the early church. Its significance is highlighted by its placement as the third section in the 1835 first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, at which time sections were not arranged chronologically, as they mostly are today, but by placing those first which were more regulatory in nature and broadly applicable to the whole church, and to missionaries and church leaders in particular. This section is actually a composite of both new explanatory material on priesthood, comprising verses 1 to 58, and a revised and redacted revelation on priesthood received way back in November 1831, comprising verses 59 to 100. Interestingly, the new material in the first 58 verses is not written in the first-person voice of the Lord, in contrast to verses 59 to 100, but rather in the descriptive third-person voice, suggesting that these verses are likely the prophet Joseph Smith's own synthesis and explanation of previously unrecorded revelations and visions he had received, rather than the revelations and visions themselves. On the whole, section 107 goes a long way toward establishing church ecclesiastical structure as we know it today. Here's the backstory. On February 14, 1835, Joseph Smith called a meeting in Kirtland, Ohio, of all those who had marched with him on Zion's camp the previous summer. At this gathering, he paid tribute to those who were willing to give their lives, if necessary, for the redemption of Zion. Then the meeting minutes say, President Joseph Smith, Jr. said that the first business of the meeting was for the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon to pray each one, and then proceed to choose 12 men from the church as apostles to go to all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people. These 12 men were accordingly selected to be ordained to the office of apostle in the church, the average age of the 12 being only 28 years old. Then, 2 weeks later, on February 28th, an additional 43 men were selected to be ordained to the office of 70 in the church for the first time in our modern era. At the time of their ordinations, both the 12 apostles and the 70s were commissioned and set apart to go to all nations, kindreds, tongues, and people to preach the gospel. During that same February and March, Joseph Smith held several meetings with the 12 apostles in Kirtland. On February 27th, for example, Joseph explained to them that they are the 12 apostles who are called to be a traveling high council to preside over all the churches of the saints among the Gentiles when there is no presidency established. He told them that they are to hold the keys of this ministry, to unlock the door of the kingdom of heaven unto all nations, and preach the gospel unto every creature. This, he said, is the virtue, power, and authority of their apostleship. In the first place, he continued, God manifested himself to me and gave me authority to establish his church, and you have received your authority from God through me. And now it is your duty to go and unlock the kingdom of heaven to foreign nations, for no man can do that thing but yourselves. Neither has any man authority or a right to go to other nations before you. And you 12 stand in the same relation to those nations that I stand in to you, that is, as a minister. At another meeting together on March 12th, Joseph proposed that because of several pressing requests from church branches in the eastern United States, the 12 should take their first mission together, traveling to and holding a series of conferences among the eastern saints for the purpose of regulating all things necessary for their welfare. While it is unclear from historical records exactly when Section 107 was written in its current form, it appears that Joseph presented the 12 with this instruction sometime before May 4th, 1835, when they departed for their mission to the east. It seems that Section 107 was initially intended to aid the 12 in their regulation of the eastern branches of the church. Yet its detailed information about the responsibilities of priesthood officers would prove to benefit the whole church generally for years to come. So that's the backstory. Now, before we look at the details of Section 107, let's outline its distinct parts. Verses 1 to 6 contain an introduction to the 2 priesthoods in the church. Verses 7 to 20 describe the rights, powers, and authority of the Melchizedek and Aaronic priesthoods and of those who hold offices within them. Verses 21 to 39 describe the responsibilities of the presiding quorums of the church and their relationships to one another. Verses 40 to 57 briefly trace the patriarchal priesthood from the time of Adam as recorded in the Book of Enoch. Verses 58 to 75 describe the order in which all the other officers of the church are to be set in relation to one another. Verses 76 to 84 explain the role of church bishops and how the most difficult cases of the church are adjudicated. And verses 85 to 100 outline the duty of those who are called to preside at the various levels of church government. Now let's dive into the details of Section 107. Verse 1 begins, "There are in the church two priesthoods, namely the Melchizedek and Aaronic, including the Levitical priesthood." This verse builds on the teachings of D&C 84, received back in September 1832, where the Lord explained that there were two priesthoods, a greater or higher priesthood, and a lesser or lower priesthood. Now here, these priesthoods are clearly named for the first time. Why the first, or higher, is called the Melchizedek priesthood, verse 2 explains, is because Melchizedek was such a great high priest. We know of Melchizedek that he was contemporary with Abraham, was a righteous priest king, is extolled highly in Joseph Smith's translation of Genesis 14 as the Prince of Peace, and in Alma 13 it is said of him that none were greater. Before his day, verse 3 continues, the Melchizedek priesthood was called the holy priesthood after the order of the Son of God. The term order, as used here, means something akin to sacred fraternity or brotherhood, which in this case would mean that the high priesthood is the holy brotherhood of the Son of God. Now, it may be helpful to pause here and note that to properly interpret key portions of Section 107, we must understand how the term priesthood is used throughout it, which contrasts significantly with how this term came to be spoken of by later church leaders and how it is commonly spoken of today. For example, whereas in the church today, the term priesthood is commonly understood to be the power of God itself, which He has entrusted worthy men to hold, in Scripture, such as verse 3 is here describing, priesthood is understood to be a holy order of priests to which worthy men belong. So in scriptural understanding, men don't hold the Aaronic priesthood, for instance. Rather, they are ordained to the Aaronic priesthood. Men aren't holders of the Melchizedek priesthood. Rather, they are members or officers within the Melchizedek priesthood. Also, the power of a priesthood was understood not as the power of God itself, but as the rights or privileges which officers within that priesthood were divinely authorized to claim or exercise. So, as we seek to properly interpret Section 107, these later, more modern understandings of priesthood, while perfectly acceptable on one level, ought to be temporarily suspended and replaced in our minds by this more original scriptural understanding of priesthood for best results. Now back to verse 3. So, prior to Melchizedek's time, the priesthood order he would belong to was called the Holy Priesthood after the order of the Son of God. But after his time, and out of respect or reverence to the name of the Supreme Being, to avoid the too frequent repetition of his name, they, the church in ancient days, called that priesthood after Melchizedek, or the Melchizedek priesthood. Now, those belonging to this priesthood order are understood to be the highest authorities in the church, while all other authorities or offices in the church are understood to be appendages to this priesthood. But, like verse 1 said, there are two divisions of priesthood, or grand heads. One is the Melchizedek priesthood, and the other is the Aaronic or Levitical priesthood. And within each priesthood order are various offices held by its members. The office of an elder, for instance, comes under the priesthood of Melchizedek. But more on offices in a minute. The Melchizedek priesthood holds the right of presidency, that is, the right to lead and preside, and has power and authority over all the offices in the church in all ages of the world, to administer in spiritual things. And the presidency of the high priesthood after the order of Melchizedek, that is, the first presidency of the church, have a right to officiate in all the offices in the church. And high priests after the order of the Melchizedek priesthood have a right to officiate in their own standing under the direction of the first presidency in administering spiritual things, and also to officiate in the office of an elder, priest of the Levitical order, teacher, deacon, and member. And an elder has a right to officiate in his stead when the high priest is not present. And since they are both of the order of Melchizedek, the high priest and elder are to administer in spiritual things, agreeable to the covenants and commandments of the church, a reference to D&C 20, called the Articles and Covenants, as well as other relevant revelations in the D&C. And they both have a right to officiate in all these offices of the church when there are no higher authorities present. So, to recap this segment, the primary right or role of those in the Melchizedek priesthood is to preside and to administer in spiritual things. The first presidency of the church is the presidency of this priesthood, presides over all church officers, and may officiate in any office at any time. And high priests and elders, both officers of the Melchizedek priesthood, may likewise officiate in all offices lower than their own. Continuing, the second priesthood is called the priesthood of Aaron, because it was conferred upon Aaron and his seed throughout all their generations. This is a close paraphrase of D&C 84:18. Now, in light of the scriptural concept of priesthood as a holy order of priests, this language of conferring a priesthood upon men is to be understood as the conferral of title or status upon them within the priesthood. Much like in medieval times, when knighthood was conferred upon a man the moment he was dubbed a knight, so priesthood is conferred upon a man the moment he is ordained a priest or other office in the priesthood. And since only Aaron and his seed had this lesser or second priesthood conferred upon them in earlier times, it is called the Aaronic priesthood. Now, why it is called the lesser priesthood is because it is an appendage to the greater or the Melchizedek priesthood and has power in administering outward ordinances. Also, the bishopric is the presidency of this priesthood and holds the keys or authority of the same. And no man has a legal right to this office of bishop to hold the keys of this priesthood, except he be a literal descendant of Aaron. But since, as explained earlier, a high priest of the Melchizedek priesthood has authority to officiate in all the lesser offices, he may officiate in the office of bishop when no literal descendant of Aaron can be found, provided he is called and set apart and ordained unto this power by the hands of the presidency of the Melchizedek priesthood, that is, the first presidency. So, to compare these two priesthoods side by side, the power and authority of the higher or Melchizedek priesthood is to hold the keys of all the spiritual blessings of the church, meaning to have the privilege of receiving the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, to have the heavens opened unto them, to commune with the general assembly and church of the firstborn, and to enjoy the communion and presence of God the Father and Jesus the mediator of the new covenant. A close paraphrase of Hebrews 12:23-24. Whereas the power and authority of the lesser or Aaronic priesthood is to hold the keys of the ministering of angels, and to administer in outward ordinances, the letter of the gospel, the baptism of repentance for the remission of sins, agreeable to the covenants and commandments. Again, a reference primarily to D&C 20. Verses 21-39 now describe the nature and responsibilities of the presiding quorums of the church and their relationships to one another. Verse 21 begins, "Of necessity there are presidents or presiding officers growing out of or appointed of or from among those who are ordained to the several offices in these two priesthoods. Of the Melchizedek priesthood, for instance, 3 presiding high priests, chosen by the body, appointed and ordained to that office, and upheld by the confidence, faith, and prayer of the church, form a quorum of the presidency of the church. Next in Melchizedek priesthood, the 12 traveling counselors are called to be the 12 apostles, or special witnesses of the name of Christ in all the world, thus differing from other officers in the church in the duties of their calling. And they form a quorum, equal in authority and power to the 3 presidents previously mentioned. That is, the quorum of the 12 apostles is equal in authority and power to the quorum of the first presidency. This fact only becomes relevant in church government, however, when the first presidency has been dissolved, such as when the church president dies and before a new first presidency is organized. Furthermore, in the Melchizedek priesthood, the 70 are also called to preach the gospel and to be as special witnesses unto the Gentiles and in all the world, thus differing from other officers in the church in the duties of their calling. The word especial here, by the way, has identical meaning to the word special as used in verse 23. And these 70 form a quorum equal in authority to that of the 12 special witnesses or apostles just named. Again, this fact of equality with the 12 would become relevant in church government only if, for some reason, the quorum of the 12 was dissolved. Such a moment has yet to happen in church history. And every decision made by either of these quorums, that is, the quorum of the 12 and the quorum of the 70, must be by the unanimous voice of the same. That is, every member in each quorum must be agreed to its decisions in order to make their decisions of the same power or validity one with the other. Also, in either quorum, a majority may form a quorum when circumstances render it impossible to be otherwise. And unless this is the case, their decisions are not entitled to the same blessings as those of the united quorum of the first presidency. The decisions of these quorums, or either of them, meaning the 12 and the 70, are to be made in all righteousness, in holiness and lowliness of heart, meekness and long-suffering, and in faith and virtue and knowledge, temperance, patience, godliness, brotherly kindness, and charity. Because the promise is, if these things abound in them, they shall not be unfruitful in the knowledge of the Lord. And in case that any decision of these quorums is made in unrighteousness, it may be brought before a general assembly of the several quorums, which constitute the spiritual authorities of the church. Otherwise, there can be no appeal from their decision. Now, speaking specifically of the 12, verse 33 says, "They are a traveling, presiding high council, to officiate in the name of the Lord, under the direction of the first presidency of the church, agreeable to the institution of heaven." In the context of 1835, this idea of the 12 as a traveling, presiding high council meant that they were to travel throughout those branches of the church that were not part of an organized stake and therefore had no high council or stake presidency, and to there build up the church and regulate all the affairs of the same. This they were eventually to do in all nations, first unto the Gentiles, and secondly unto the Jews. Over time, as the number of stakes increased dramatically and were organized the world over, the role of the 12 increased in significance and came to include stakes within their jurisdiction as well. The 70, verse 34 continues, are to act in the name of the Lord, under the direction of the 12 or the traveling high council, in their work of building up the church and regulating all the affairs of the same in all nations, first unto the Gentiles and then to the Jews. The 70 must work under the 12's direction because the 12 were the ones sent out holding the keys to open the door by the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, because of their appointment to travel and their broad jurisdiction throughout the world, the 12 and 70 would come to be known as general authorities. Meanwhile, local standing high councils at the stakes of Zion, which in 1835 included only one stake at Kirtland, form a quorum equal in authority in the affairs of the church, in all their decisions, to the quorum of the presidency or to the traveling high council. Likewise, the high council in Zion, which was organized in Missouri the previous year, form a quorum equal in authority in the affairs of the church, in all their decisions, to the councils of the 12 at the stakes of Zion. What verses 36 and 37 are describing here were true in 1835, but are no longer applicable today for this reason. The presidency of the High Council in the Kirtland stake at the time was the first presidency of the church. Thus, the decisions reached by the first presidency with their stake High Council were just as authoritative as those decisions reached by the first presidency alone, or as those decisions reached by the 12. The decisions of the Missouri High Council also had as much authority in Zion as those of the 12 abroad in the areas where no stakes were organized. So today, since the first presidency is not also the presidency of any stake high council, and since the quorum of the 12 now also have jurisdiction over all stakes in the world, these verses are obsolete. Verse 38 continues, "It is the duty of the traveling high council to call upon the 70 when they need assistance, to fill the several calls for preaching and administering the gospel, instead of any others. Also, it is the duty of the 12, in all large branches of the church, to ordain evangelical ministers, as they shall be designated unto them by revelation." From early historical sources, it appears that evangelical ministers is a reference to those of the office of patriarch. Joseph Smith later taught, for instance, an evangelist is a patriarch, and wherever the church of Christ is established in the earth, there should be a patriarch for the benefit of the posterity of the saints, as it was with Jacob, in giving his patriarchal blessing unto his sons. Verses 40 to 57 now briefly trace the history and nature of this patriarchal priesthood. Verse 40 begins, "The order of this priesthood was confirmed to be handed down from father to son, and rightly belongs to the literal descendants of the chosen seed, to whom the promises were made." This chosen seed to whom the promises were made is a reference to that chosen family who plays center stage throughout most of the Bible. They are most well known as the house of Israel, or the descendants of the patriarchs or fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. To these patriarchs and to Israel as a whole, promises were famously made concerning how the Lord would work through them and their posterity to bless all the families of the earth. What verse 40 and the following verses add to the well-known biblical narrative is that these key promises were made to those who were within a patriarchal order of priesthood, that is, a family-based priesthood order, which is, no doubt, an appendage to the Melchizedek priesthood itself. And what is perhaps even more insightful is that this priesthood order did not begin with Father Abraham, as one might guess by reading the Bible. Instead, this order was instituted in the days of Adam and came down by lineage from Father Adam to several of Abraham's ancestral line, namely, from Adam to his son Seth, who was ordained by Adam into this order at the age of 69 years. Adam also ordained Seth's son Enos, Enos' son Canaan, Canaan's son Mahalalel, Mahalalel's son Jared, and Jared's son Enoch, the same Enoch who was translated with his city. Adam lastly ordained Enoch's son Methuselah. Then Methuselah's son Lamech was ordained by Seth, and finally, according to this account, Lamech's son Noah was ordained to this patriarchal priesthood order by Methuselah. 3 years previous to the death of Adam, the account continues, he called Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, and Methuselah, all whom Adam himself had ordained, and who were all high priests, together with the residue of his posterity who were righteous, into the valley of Adam-on-Diaman. and there he bestowed upon them his last blessing. And on this unforgettable occasion, the Lord appeared unto them, and they rose up and blessed Adam, and called him Michael, the Prince, the Archangel. And the Lord administered comfort unto Adam, and said unto him, I have set thee to be at the head, presumably the head of the human family, and the head of the patriarchal order of priesthood. A multitude of nations shall come of thee, and thou art a prince over them forever. After this blessing from the Lord, Adam stood up in the midst of the congregation, and notwithstanding he was bowed down with age, being full of the Holy Ghost, predicted whatsoever should befall his posterity unto the latest generation. These things were all written in the book of Enoch, verse 57 concludes, and are to be testified of in due time. It's interesting to note that verses 53 to 55 were included almost word for word of a blessing Joseph Smith gave to his father Joseph Smith Sr., wherein he states that as one ordained to the patriarchal priesthood, Joseph Smith Sr. was to gather together his posterity just as Adam had done. This blessing was recorded by Oliver Cowdery in September 1835, several months after Section 107 was written. So, to summarize verses 39 to 57, it is the duty of the 12 apostles to ordain men to this patriarchal order of priesthood with its tremendously rich history, as it shall be designated unto them by revelation. Now, continuing in verse 58, it is the duty of the 12 also to ordain and set in order all the other officers of the church, agreeable to the revelation which says, now from verse 59 to the end of this section in verse 100 is quoted a heretofore unpublished revelation on priesthood received by Joseph years earlier on November 11, 1831. Or, to be more precise, what is now quoted is an edited, revised, and updated version of that 1831 revelation on priesthood, wherein the Lord outlines the various gradations of church officers and their duties. And it is these officers that are to be set in order or organized by the 12, according to this updated revelation. Verse 59 begins, To the church of Christ in the land of Zion, in addition to the church laws respecting church business, verily I say unto you, saith the Lord of hosts, there must needs be presiding elders to preside over those who are of the office of an elder, and also priests to preside over those who are of the office of a priest, and also teachers to preside over those who are of the office of teacher in like manner, and also the deacons. Wherefore, presidents are to be appointed at each level, from deacon to teacher, and from teacher to priest, and from priest to elder. Then comes the high priesthood, which is the greatest of all. Wherefore, it must needs be that one be appointed of the high priesthood to preside over the priesthood, and he shall be called president of the high priesthood of the church, or, in other words, the presiding high priest over the high priesthood of the church. This occurred, by the way, in January 1832, when Joseph Smith was appointed as the president of the high priesthood. So, at every level, from the deacons to the high priests, there are to be presidents appointed. Verse 68 clarifies that the office of a bishop is not equal unto that of the presiding high priest of the church, since the office of a bishop is in administering all temporal things. Nevertheless, a bishop must be chosen from the high priesthood, unless he is a literal descendant of Aaron, according to the stipulations outlined back in verses 16 and 17, and in D&C 68, 15 to 21, which are again briefly reviewed here in verses 70 to 76. And, in addition to being set apart unto the ministering of temporal things, a bishop's duty is also to be a judge in Israel. That is, to sit in judgment upon transgressors upon testimony, as it shall be laid before him according to the laws, by the assistance of his counselors. Thus shall he be a common judge among the inhabitants of Zion, or in a stake of Zion, or in any branch of the church where he shall be set apart unto this ministry. Yet as for the most important business of the church, and the most difficult cases of the church, inasmuch as there is not satisfaction upon the decision of the bishop or judges, the protocol is that it shall be handed over and carried up unto the council of the church, before the presidency of the high priesthood, that is, the first presidency, who may call other high priests to assist them. And this is the highest council of the church of God, and a final decision upon controversies in spiritual matters. There is not any person belonging to the church who is exempt from this council of the church. And, in the event that a member of the first presidency shall transgress, he shall be had in remembrance before the common council of the church. That is, a council presided over by the presiding common judge or bishop of the church, who shall be assisted by 12 counselors of the high priesthood, and their decision upon his head shall be an end of controversy concerning him. Thus none, not even the first presidency, shall be exempted from the justice and the laws of God, that all things may be done in order and in solemnity before him, according to truth and righteousness. Verses 85 to 100 conclude by outlining the duty of those who are called to preside at the various levels of church government. Whether presiding over the office of a deacon, office of the teachers, or the office of priests, referred to here as the priesthood of Aaron, the president of each group of various sizes is to sit in council with them and to teach them the duties of their office as given in the covenants, that is, in D&C 20. This is also true of the president over the office of elders, which, it is noted, is a distinct presidency from that of the 70 and is designed for those who do not travel into all the world. That is, the office of elders is primarily concerned with local affairs, in contrast with the 70 who are to travel into all the world under the direction of the 12. As for the duty of the president of the office of the high priesthood, or church president, he is to preside over the whole church, and to be like unto Moses, yea, to be a seer, a revelator, a translator, and a prophet, having all the gifts of God which he bestows upon the head of the church. And as for the presidency of the 70, it is according to the vision showing the order of the 70, he says, referencing an unrecorded vision of the prophet Joseph, that they should have 7 presidents to preside over them, chosen out of the number of the 70. And the 7th president of these presidents is to preside over the 6. And these 7 presidents are to choose other 70 besides the first 70 to whom they belong, and are to preside over them. And additional quorums of 70 can continue to be called and organized until 7 times 70, the Lord says, if the labor in the vineyard of necessity requires it. And these 70 are to be traveling ministers, unto the Gentiles first and also unto the Jews. As for other officers of the church, who belong not unto the 12, neither to the 70, they are not under the responsibility to travel among all nations, but are to travel as their circumstances shall allow, notwithstanding they may hold as high and responsible offices in the church. Wherefore the Lord concludes, now let every man learn his duty, and to act in the office in which he is appointed, in all diligence, warning that he that is slothful shall not be counted worthy to stand. And he that learns not his duty and shows himself not approved shall not be counted worthy to stand. Even so, amen. So, to summarize section 107, we could say that not only was it a great benefit in 1835 to the newly called 12 and 70 to help them regulate the church, its organizational usefulness has, for the most part, stood the test of time. Indeed, today's church ecclesiastical structure is still directly informed by D&C 107 nearly 200 years later. And it essentially updated D&C 20's administrative guidelines and codification of the roles of church officers, as well as clarified and elaborated upon D&C 84's teachings on priesthood. In fact, its choice insights into the history and doctrine of priesthood, including the Melchizedek, patriarchal, and Aaronic orders of priesthood, are among the greatest ever revealed through the prophet Joseph Smith. And that's the story of Doctrine and Covenants 107.